The house was too clean. That was the first thing Arthur noticed as he stepped through the heavy oak front door, a door he had sanded and stained himself 3 summers ago, back when he believed labor was a form of love. The air inside didn't smell like a home, it smelled like a showroom. There was the sharp, antiseptic tang of lemon polish and the heavy, cloying scent of white lilies, Lillian's favorite. They were everywhere, in the foyer, on the mahogany dining table, even in the small nook where Arthur used to keep his architectural sketches. Now, his sketches were tucked away in a drawer, replaced by a minimalist vase that cost more than his first car. It was a Tuesday evening, a day that held no inherent significance, yet the atmosphere was heavy with a pressure Arthur couldn't quite name. The rain streaked against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their suburban sanctuary, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floors. Arthur sat in his armchair, the one Lillian had repeatedly called an eyesore, because its worn leather clashed with her vision of modern elegance. He didn't turn on the lights. He watched the gray light of the dying day fade into a bruised purple. When the garage door finally hummed to life, Arthur didn't flinch. He listened to the rhythmic click of her heels on the concrete, the chime of the security system disarming, and then the door opening. Lillian walked in, shedding her designer trench coat like a second skin, letting it fall onto the bench with a casualness that bordered on disdain. She looked radiant, charged with a frantic, electric energy that felt entirely alien to the quiet stillness of their living room. She didn't look at him. She walked straight to the blackened window, using it as a mirror to check her reflection. She tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear, her eyes searching her own image for something Arthur clearly could no longer provide. "Don't you ever get tired of just being here, Arthur?" she asked. Her voice was light, but it trailed off into a heavy, practiced sigh that filled the room. Arthur remained motionless, a shadow among shadows. "Here is where our life is, Lily. I thought we built this so we wouldn't have to be anywhere else." She turned then, a sharp, pitying smile cutting across her face. In the dim light, her teeth looked unervingly white. "No, Arthur. This is where your life is. I feel like I'm living in a museum of fine. You're a fine husband. We have a fine house. You have a fine, steady job at the firm. But God, it's suffocating. It's like being married to a dial tone. Just a constant, steady, predictable hum that never changes, never rises, and never makes me feel anything." She walked past him, the scent of her expensive perfume, something spicy and unfamiliar, lingering in the air like a taunt. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. To her, Arthur was a solved puzzle, a book she had read 1,000 times and found lacking in its final chapters. Arthur watched her go, his heart beating with a slow, rhythmic thud. He wasn't angry. Anger required a level of surprise that he no longer possessed. He felt a profound sense of observation, as if he were a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction. She was right about one thing: he was steady. But she had mistaken his steadiness for a lack of depth, and his silence for a lack of perception. For 10 years, he had been the foundation. He had handled the taxes, the repairs, the long-term investments, and the emotional labor of keeping her world upright while she pursued her passions that changed with the seasons. He had been the safety net she never thought she'd fall into. But as he sat there in the dark, Arthur realized that a foundation is only useful if there is something worth supporting. Lillian was no longer building a life with him, she was decorating a stage for a play he wasn't invited to perform in. The dial tone she mocked was the sound of a heart that had stopped trying to harmonize with a siren. As he listened to her humming a tune upstairs, a melody he didn't recognize, Arthur felt the first crack in his own resolve. It wasn't a break, it was an opening. Arthur and Lillian are locked in a classic avoidant anxious attachment dance that has finally soured into contempt. Psychologically, Lillian is experiencing hedonic adaptation. She has become so accustomed to the security Arthur provides that she no longer perceives it as a benefit, but as a sensory deprivation chamber. Her insult, comparing him to a dial tone, reveals her deep-seated fear of stasis. She craves high-arousal emotional states to feel alive, mistaking chaos for passion. Arthur, conversely, is operating from a place of active observation. His refusal to argue isn't a sign of weakness, but a psychological withdrawal. By staying in the dark, he is creating a literal and metaphorical boundary. He is transitioning from a participant in the marriage to a witness of its decay. This shift is a defense mechanism. By intellectualizing her cruelty as a predictable chemical reaction, he numbs the acute pain of her rejection. Their conflict stems from a fundamental mismatch. Lillian views a real man as a source of entertainment and validation, while Arthur views a real man as a source of stability and integrity. The tragedy lies in the fact that Lillian is about to destroy the very safety she unknowingly relies on to survive. The week that followed was a masterclass in domestic theater. Arthur moved through the house with the practiced grace of a ghost. He went to work, he came home, he ate the meals Lillian prepared with a distracted air, and he listened to her talk about her late nights at the gallery. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check her phone. He didn't need to. The air between them had become so thin that the truth was beginning to bleed through the wallpaper. The confirmation arrived on a rainy Friday. Lillian had left for a charity gala, looking stunning in a backless silk dress that cost a month's mortgage. In her haste, she had left her laptop open on the kitchen island, the screen glowing like a radioactive beacon in the darkened room. Arthur stood before it for a long time. His hands were steady, but his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't a man who invaded privacy. He believed in the sanctity of a partner's internal world. But Lillian had already invited a stranger into that world. Arthur was simply looking at the guest list. A notification pinged. Then another. Next Friday, the usual suite. I miss your fire. He still hasn't noticed. God, he really is a dial tone, isn't he? The name attached to the messages was Marcus. Arthur knew the name. Marcus was a freelance curator, a man who spoke in grand metaphors and wore suits that were too tight and smiles that were too wide. He was the fire Lillian craved, unpredictable, reckless, and entirely devoid of the substance required to actually sustain a life. Arthur didn't feel the urge to scream. He didn't want to throw the laptop through the window. Instead, he felt a strange, chilling sensation of relief. The ambiguity was gone. The ice he had felt growing in his chest finally froze solid, providing him with a floor he could actually stand on. He realized that for years, he had been trying to fix a leak in a dam that had already burst. He didn't close the laptop. He didn't delete the messages. He simply stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of expensive lilies and the hum of the refrigerator, and began to map out the geography of his new life. He looked at the kitchen island, the marble surface he had painstakingly selected, and realized it was no longer his. Nothing in this house was his, because nothing in this house was real. He spent the next 4 hours in his study. He wasn't crying. He was working. He pulled up their joint accounts, their property deeds, and the mountain of digital footprints Lillian had left behind. She had been careless. People like Lillian, who thrive on the fire of the moment, rarely think about the ashes they leave behind. They assume the dial tone isn't listening. They assume the steady man is too slow to catch up. Arthur realized he hadn't been slow. He had just been waiting for the right moment to stop running. The discovery of the messages acts as the terminal cause in a long chain of marital neglect. The initial cause was the silence and lack of communication. The effect is the inevitable migration of Lillian's loyalty towards someone who validates her ego. Marcus serves as the catalyst, but the explosion was preset by the couple's inability to reconcile their differing definitions of intimacy. Specifically, Arthur's decision to remain a silent observer triggered Lillian's escalation into recklessness. Because she didn't receive a reaction to her dial tone insults, she pushed further, seeking a more extreme form of validation outside the home. This caused a total breakdown of the social contract of their marriage. The effect on Arthur is a psychological phenomenon known as post-betrayal clarity. Once the ambiguity of suspicion is replaced by the certainty of proof, his brain switches from an emotional fight-or-flight state to a cognitive problem-solving state. The consequence of Lillian's digital carelessness is that she has handed Arthur the tactical advantage. Her belief that he was too slow led her to leave the laptop open, a mistake that directly triggers Arthur's transition from a husband to a strategist, ensuring that the eventual fallout will be entirely on his terms. The house remained a pristine tomb of their shared history, but the air inside had changed. It was no longer stagnant, it was charged with the electricity of a coming storm that only one of them could see. Arthur didn't confront Lillian that night. He didn't even close the laptop. He simply walked away from the glowing screen, leaving her secrets exactly where she had carelessly dropped them. The next morning, he woke up before the sun. Usually, he would lie in bed, careful not to disturb her, waiting for the soft chime of her alarm. Today, he rose with a heavy, deliberate step. He didn't make her vanilla almond milk latte. He made a pot of black coffee, bitter, strong, and entirely for himself. When Lillian finally emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than Arthur's first drafting table, she stopped short. She looked at the empty coffee carafe, then at Arthur, who was already dressed in a suit she hadn't seen in years, a charcoal gray number that made his shoulders look broader and his jawline sharper. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep and a lingering trace of the wine from the night before. "Time waits for no one, Lily," Arthur replied. He didn't look up from his tablet. He was busy reviewing a spreadsheet that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with the forensic accounting of their decade together. "Are you going somewhere?" She leaned against the counter, her eyes narrowing as she tried to find the dial tone she was so used to. But the frequency had changed. Arthur was broadcasting on a wave she couldn't tune into. "I have a lot to catch up on," he said, standing up. He caught her gaze for a split second. For the first time, he didn't see the woman he had promised to protect, he saw a liability. "By the way, the lilies are dying. You should probably throw them out." He walked out before she could respond. Throughout the day, he felt a strange, intoxicating sense of lightness. He visited a lawyer, not a family lawyer, but a specialist in high-asset protection. He moved his personal inheritance into a private trust. He changed the passwords to the cloud accounts she never bothered to check because she thought he was too predictable to ever hide anything. By the time he returned home that evening, he wasn't the man who had sat in the dark a few days prior. He was a man who had already moved out in his mind. He found Lillian in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, looking uncharacteristically restless. "Where were you, Arthur? I called you 3 times. "I was out," he said, tossing his keys onto the marble island. "I realized I've spent too much time being predictable for everyone else's sake. It's time I saw what I'm like when I'm just me." The confusion on her face was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. She had spent years convincing herself he was a boring, static object. Now that the object was moving, she didn't know whether to be annoyed or afraid. The primary mistake Lillian makes in this block is underestimation based on familiarity. She assumed that because Arthur's behavior had been consistent for a decade, his capacity for change was non-existent. This reveals a common psychological blind spot, confusing a partner's patience for a lack of options. The lesson here is that silence in a relationship is rarely empty, it is often a reservoir of unexpressed data. Arthur's mistake, conversely, was his long-term self-erasure, adapting his routine and desires to fit Lillian's aesthetic. His realization is that by becoming the perfect foundation, he made himself invisible. The lesson he learns is that integrity without boundaries is simply a recipe for being walked upon. His shift from self-erasure to self-validation is a protective measure. By stopping the coffee-making ritual and changing his attire, he is signaling the end of his service to her ego. This exposes a hidden truth. Lillian didn't actually want a real man or excitement, she wanted a predictable servant who also managed to be exciting. When he stops being the servant, her world begins to tilt, proving that her suffocation was actually a luxury provided by his quiet labor. The tension in the house grew like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Lillian tried to regain her footing by swinging between cold detachment and sudden, jarring bursts of affection. She would touch his arm as he passed, or ask about his day with a forced, high-pitched interest. Arthur accepted these gestures with a polite, distant smile that never reached his eyes. He was watching her perform the role of a wife, and it was the most transparent acting he had ever seen. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday. Arthur had spent the afternoon at a local gym, a place he had avoided for years. The physical exertion felt like a purging of the decade of stagnation he had endured. When he walked through the front door, drenched in sweat and breathing deeply, he found Lillian standing in the middle of the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling. The laptop was open again. But this time, she was looking at the screen he had left active, a document outlining the sale of their house and a summary of the messages between her and Marcus, highlighted in a sterile, professional yellow. "Arthur, what is this?" Her voice was a ragged whisper. He didn't rush to her. He didn't apologize. He walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and took a long, slow drink. "That," he said, wiping his mouth, "is the reality of our situation. You wanted a man who wasn't a dial tone. You wanted someone who wasn't predictable. Well, I've decided to stop being predictable." Lillian's eyes filled with tears, the kind of tears that come from fear, not regret. "You were spying on me? You went through my things?" "I didn't have to spy, Lily. You left the door wide open. You were so convinced I was too blind to see that you didn't even bother to hide the evidence. You treated me like a piece of furniture that wouldn't notice if you brought someone else into the room." She tried to step toward him, her hands reaching out. "It was a mistake, Arthur. Marcus, he meant nothing. I was just bored, I was lonely." "You weren't lonely," Arthur interrupted, his voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "You were entitled. You wanted the security I provided while you chased the thrills he promised. You wanted a house built on a rock while you danced in the fire. But the fire consumed the house, Lily. And the rock is moving on." He walked past her toward the bedroom to pack a bag. He didn't need to stay another night. The exit interview, as he had thought of it, was over. He had presented the facts, and there was no room for negotiation. In this pivotal turning point, the expectations versus reality gap reaches a devastating climax. Lillian expected that if her affair was ever discovered, Arthur would react with a predictable, emotional collapse, begging, crying, or perhaps an outburst of rage that she could then use to justify her own actions, labeling him unstable. Instead, her reality is a man who has already emotionally and legally disengaged. Arthur's reality, however, is the death of his illusion of reciprocity. He believed that by being steady, he was earning loyalty. The awakening he experiences is that loyalty cannot be bought with stability if the other person doesn't value their own integrity. Psychologically, this block shows the collapse of the narcissistic supply. Lillian isn't crying because she lost Arthur, she's crying because she lost the version of Arthur she could control. Her attempt to frame him as the spy is a desperate defense mechanism to flip the narrative, but Arthur's calm indifference renders that tactic useless. He has realized that the exciting man she claimed to want was actually a man who stood up for himself, a reality she finds terrifying now that she has to face the consequences of his newfound strength. The bedroom, once a sanctuary of shared dreams, felt like a cold, sterile gallery. Arthur didn't rush. He moved with a surgical precision that seemed to unnerve Lillian more than any outburst of rage could have. He pulled a suitcase from the top of the closet, the one they had bought together for their honeymoon in Florence, and laid it flat on the bed. Lillian stood in the doorway, her silhouette trembling against the hallway light. The fire she had chased with Marcus had left her cold, and now the rock she had leaned on was shifting beneath her feet. "You're really leaving? Just like that?" she asked, her voice cracking. "After 10 years, you're not even going to fight for us?" Arthur paused, a single silk tie in his hand. He looked at it, then at her. "I've been fighting for us for a decade, Lily. I fought for us every morning I made you coffee while you dreamed of someone else. I fought for us every time I balanced our books so you could spend your days at the gallery. The problem isn't that I'm not fighting. The problem is that I was the only one in the ring." He tucked the tie into the suitcase. "You didn't want a fighter. You wanted a spectator. You wanted someone to applaud your life while you lived it behind my back." Lillian's face twisted. The guilt was finally breaking through the layer of ego. "I was bored, Arthur. Can't you understand that? It was just excitement. It didn't mean anything." "That's the most devastating part, Lily," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. "It meant nothing to you, yet you traded everything for it. You traded my trust, our history, and the man I was, for nothing. If Marcus meant everything, I could at least respect the passion. But you threw us away for a whim." He zipped the suitcase. The sound was sharp, final, the sound of a closing chapter. As he walked toward the door, Lillian grabbed his arm. Her grip was tight, desperate, her nails digging into the fabric of his new suit. "I'll change, Arthur. I promise. We can go to counseling. I'll block him. I'll do anything." Arthur looked down at her hand, then up at her tear-streaked face. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to wipe those tears away. He felt a profound, peaceful detachment. "You're not asking me to stay because you love me, Lillian," he said gently, almost pityingly. "You're asking me to stay because you're afraid of the silence. You're afraid of what your life looks like without the dial tone keeping the lights on. But the lights are out, Lily. And I'm not the one holding the switch anymore. This block represents the final stage of relational dissolution. In the psychology of divorce, there is a point of no return where the betrayed partner moves from hurt to indifference. For Arthur, that point was reached the moment he realized Lillian's affair meant nothing to her. To him, this revealed a level of nihilism and disrespect that made reconciliation impossible. We see the stages of grief in Lillian: denial, "You're really leaving," bargaining, "I'll change, we can go to counseling," and a desperate attempt at reattachment. However, her motivations are exposed as self-serving. She is experiencing transition anxiety, fear of the loss of the lifestyle and security Arthur provides, rather than the loss of his soul. Arthur's use of the spectator metaphor perfectly encapsulates the imbalance. By identifying that he was the only one in the ring, he recognizes that the marriage ended long before the affair started. The point of no return isn't the physical act of moving out, it is the moment Arthur stopped valuing Lillian's validation of his real man status and started validating himself. Arthur moved into a small loft in the city, close to the architectural firm where he worked. It was a space of concrete, glass, and light, minimalist, but unlike Lillian's museum, this place felt alive. There were no white lilies. There was only the scent of fresh rain and the stacks of sketches he had finally brought out of the drawer. He didn't check Lillian's social media. He didn't ask their mutual friends how she was doing. He simply existed. He started taking long walks through the city, noticing the intricate details of the buildings he had helped design, details he had forgotten to appreciate while he was busy maintaining the foundation of a crumbling marriage. A month later, he received a final email from her. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a cold, formal update on the sale of the house. He learned through the grapevine that the fire with Marcus had burned out within weeks. Without the thrill of the forbidden, without the backdrop of a boring husband to rebel against, Marcus had become just another man with too many metaphors and not enough substance. Lillian was alone in a rented apartment, trying to find a new version of herself that didn't require a spectator. One afternoon, Arthur sat at a cafe, a blank sketchbook in front of him. A woman at the next table noticed his drawings, sketches of a new bridge, a structure built on balance and transparency. "That's beautiful," she said. "It looks incredibly strong, but also light." Arthur looked at her, then back at his work. "It has to be both," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips. "If it's too heavy, it cracks. If it's too light, it blows away. It's all about the integrity of the materials." He realized then that he was no longer a dial tone. He was the architect of his own experience. The betrayal hadn't broken him, it had acted as a controlled demolition, clearing away a structure that was too weak to stand, allowing him to build something that was finally, undeniably, real. The story's conclusion offers a broader reflection on the nature of perception and truth. Betrayal is often portrayed as a tragedy, but in a meta-context, it serves as a truth serum. It forces the characters to see the reality of their dynamics without the veil of social performance. The final move Arthur made wasn't leaving the house, it was reclaiming his own narrative. Lillian's collapse following Marcus's departure highlights a universal insight: many affairs are parasitic. They require the host of a stable marriage to provide the tension that makes the affair feel exciting. Once the host is gone, the parasite dies. Arthur's growth from a foundation to an architect represents the psychological journey from external validation to internal autonomy. The lesson here is that trust, once broken, cannot be glued back together, but the person who held that trust can be reforged into something more resilient. The silence that Lillian feared became Arthur's greatest asset, a space for rebuilding and a testament to the fact that being steady is only a weakness if you are standing in the wrong place. The narrative arc of Arthur and Lillian serves as a profound exploration of the silent collapse of modern relationships. The story begins with a facade of perfection and ends with a reality of individual liberation. We learn that stability is often mistaken for stagnation by those who lack internal depth. Arthur's steadiness was his greatest virtue, but in the hands of a partner who sought constant external stimulation, it became a weapon used against him. The affair with Marcus illustrates that excitement is often a poor substitute for substance. Betrayal is frequently a maladaptive coping mechanism for boredom, and its consequences are far more permanent than the feelings that triggered it. Arthur's character growth demonstrates that the ultimate response to betrayal isn't revenge, but indifference. By refusing to play the victim, he denied Lillian the emotional drama she craved, leaving her to face the cold reality of her actions alone. Arthur's journey is one of reclamation. He reclaimed his career, his aesthetic, and his self-worth. He moved from being a dial tone to being a voice. Lillian's journey is one of consequence. She was forced to realize that the safe person in her life was actually the strongest person in her life. The story closes not with a grand reconciliation, but with authenticity. The bridge Arthur sketches in the end symbolizes his new life, strong, light, and built on integrity. The betrayal was the catalyst for his awakening, proving that sometimes, the only way to find yourself is to let the person you were pretending to be for someone else finally walk away.